Planning on visiting Skagway, Alaska? Then don't miss this hidden gem that's nestled along the stunning coastline. A rock wall by the docks that has been adorned with colorful graffiti for more than 100 years. And the best views of it may even be from the deck of your cruise ship. Hi, I'm Tiffany from Destination for Vacation. When it comes to most graffiti, one person's art is another person's eyesore. But I think you'll agree with me that this graffiti is a little different. And there are 3 specific designs that I'll talk about in this video that you might want to look for the next time you're in Skagway. Join me in exploring this unique guest book of visitors. Each piece of graffiti tells a story, whether it be a declaration of love, a political statement, or simply a colorful design meant to cheer passerbys. Skagway's graffiti wall can be traced back to the early 20th century when sailors and visitors passing through the town would leave their marks on the rocks as a way of commemorating their visit. As the years passed, the tradition of adding graffiti to the rock wall continued, with locals and tourists alike contributing their own artistic touches to this ever-evolving canvas. Skagway's port has 3 docks, allowing 4 ships to dock at a time. The railroad dock is the closest to the mountain and is pretty much face-to-face with the cliff. In 2018, Carnival Corporation, which owns Carnival, Princess, and Holland America cruise lines, purchased the entire White Pass and Yukon Railway Company, including its docks, in a $290 million deal. So chances are, if you're on one of those cruise lines, you'll be docking just yards away from this colorful nod to history. This picture, taken from the balcony of my cabin, shows just how close that dock is to the graffiti wall. The first piece of graffiti I'd like to draw your attention to has been on this wall for nearly 100 years, and it's certainly eye-catching. Thousands of tourists have seen it through the years, but most probably didn't make the connection to one of Skagway's more infamous characters. Everyone, take a look at Soapy Smith's skull. This graffiti has been keeping the memory of Jefferson Randolph Smith, aka Soapy Smith, alive ever since it was painted on the rock wall in 1926. Jefferson Randolph Smith was born in 1860 to a well-educated, wealthy family in Georgia. His great-grandfather owned one of the finest plantations in the area, and his father was a lawyer. But the family's prosperity took a turn for the worse after the Civil War, and they moved to Texas. After figuring out that the life of a cowboy just wasn't for him, Jefferson began his career in crime while in Fort Worth, forming an association with a small, close-knit group of thieves, convincing gullible victims to part with their cash in clever confidence games. 3-card Monte, shell games, and other short cons were used because they were quick, allowing the gang to move on to their next unsuspecting victim. Known as a persuasive man with a silver tongue, Soapy got his nickname from one of his original scams, which involved selling, you guessed it, soap. He'd set up shop on a busy street corner using a suitcase on a tripod. As curious passersby stopped to look, he explained that he sold 2 different kinds of soap. In one pile, an ordinary, but according to him, miracle-working soap, which was sold at about a nickel a bar. But as he would talk, he would begin to wrap some of those soap bars with paper bills, ranging from a $1 bill all the way up to a $100 bill. Then he'd rewrap those bars again in plain paper. This was the prize package soap sell. He explained that he was selling a new formulation of soap that cleaned better, lasted a lot longer, and smelled just fine. In an attempt to spread the word about this fabulous new product, he had been authorized to offer cash prizes. While he talked and as the crowd watched, Soapy would unwrap a bar of soap from the plain pile, insert a $100 bill between the soap and the outer paper, and then he'd rewrap the bar and mix it up with the other bars of soap in the second prize package pile. Unbeknownst to the crowd, one of the first customers to quickly buy a bar of soap was actually one of Soapy's associates who pretended to be a passerby. He happily opened a bar up in front of the crowd and, wouldn't you know it, find a $100 bill. That's all it took for the crowd to go wild and surge forward to buy as many of the $5 bars of soap as they could afford. Soapy easily sold the entire suitcase of soap in minutes. But unfortunately for the purchasers, Soapy had a gift for the sleight of hand, and the only people who ever unwrapped the soap to find a prize were Smith's associates. It was an ingenious scam which made his gang an enormous amount of money. Soapy and his gang continued this scam after moving to Denver, Colorado, and then started expanding operations to larger cons, which involved things like fake stock exchanges and lottery offices. He soon proclaimed that he was the boss of Denver's underworld crime empire. When the Colorado silver boom started, he and his gang moved to the town of Cree, Colorado, expanding and diversifying his criminal operations, and eventually even brought his scams to Mexico. The discovery of gold in Bonanza Creek in Canada's Yukon Territory brought 75,000 prospectors to the area. Skagway became the port of entry to make the long and difficult trek over the White Pass in the hopes of finding sudden wealth. And Soapy Smith and his gang decided to do a little prospecting of their own for prospectors. At the time, Skagway was a little bit short on law and order, but it had plenty of gold dust. So Soapy and his gang decided it was the perfect place to perfect their con games. He started a saloon in Skagway called Jeff Smith's Parlor, continuing his scams. He became well known for his heavy drinking, criminal antics, and his black temper. But in 1898, when Soapy's gang took about $2,800 in gold from a relatively new prospector, the town's vigilantes became fed up. They organized a meeting, and when Soapy heard about this, he decided to attend, bringing his rifle with the goal of intimidating the meeting's attendees to see things his way. When denied entry, he began arguing with one of the guards, which quickly escalated into a gunfight. Soapy was shot dead, instantly dying from a bullet straight through his heart. The guard he was arguing with, Frank Reed, suffered a shot to the groin and died 12 agonizing days later. Frank was buried with full honors in Skagway's city cemetery. Soapy Smith, however, was denied these honors and was instead buried several yards away from the cemetery. Today, you can visit the Gold Rush Cemetery and see the supposed final resting place of Soapy Smith, but this wasn't his initial grave. Rumor has it that the Great Flood of 1919 not only carried away a government bridge, but the raging floodwaters also washed Soapy Smith's remains out to sea. In the fall of 1926, someone looked at the dockside rock formation and thought, wow, this section looks just like Soapy Smith's skull. Now, we don't know who this was, nor does history shed any light on what chemical enhancements may have led to this realization. But it resulted in a masterpiece that's been greeting tourists for about 100 years. Photos and postcards immortalizing the work have been sold in the decades since. So the next time you're by the docks, make sure to say hi to Skagway's most notorious citizen, or at least his skull. But the rock wall's graffiti not only recognizes one of Skagway's most colorful characters, it also serves as a unique record of the ships that have passed through the port throughout the years. The sailors and crew members of various cruise ships have recorded their vessel's maiden visit to this port ever since 1928. The idea caught on, and now the granite wall is covered with the names and logos of visiting ships. The ship registry markings often take the form of the ship's name, captain, date of arrival, and sometimes even a small illustration or logo representing the ship or cruise line. Each inscription represents a piece of maritime history, capturing a moment in time when that ship first docked at Skagway. Someone on the crew of the Celebrity Millennium even chose to commemorate the ship's return to Skagway after the worldwide cruise industry shut down due to the COVID pandemic. This rather unassuming piece of graffiti leads us to another interesting tidbit of history. There are actually 2 pieces of graffiti dedicated to the Princess Louise. Unfortunately, I didn't capture one of them as I was taking my pictures. But if you search SS Princess Louise Graffiti, Skagway, you'll see the other piece, which was photographed by Brian Costellas. It's uncertain if both honor the same ship because there have been at least 2 Princess Louise ships delivering tourists to Skagway's doorstep over the years. The first Princess Louise, built in 1869, was originally named Olympia, but was later renamed Louise 10 years later to honor the 4th daughter of Queen Victoria. In 1898, the ship began to carry prospectors to the Klondike goldfields. She served in that capacity for nearly 35 years, with 10 additional years of service after she was converted into a barge. Then, in disrepair, she eventually sunk near Vancouver Island in 1919. 2 years later, the second Princess Louise went into service, nearly twice the size of her predecessor. The 331-foot Princess Louise was built in North Vancouver for tourist service to Alaska by the Canadian Pacific Railway Fleet. At the time of her launch on August 29, 1921, she was the largest ship in the Princess Fleet. She was built as a passenger and cargo vessel to replace the SS Princess Sophia, which had sunk near Juneau, Alaska in October of 1918. All 364 people aboard the ship died, and to this day, the wreck of the Princess Sophia is considered to be the worst maritime loss of life in the history of Alaska. Considered to be a luxury cruise ship of her era, the Princess Louise was run by the British Columbia Coast Steamships. She originally had 133 first-class staterooms and 26 single berths. Her dining room seated 125 people, and her total occupancy was 600. She carried passengers on the 1,750-mile round-trip voyage between Vancouver and Alaska until she was retired in 1964. After she was removed from service, she was purchased by restaurateur Jerry Sutton and moved to California. She was given a permanent berth at Terminal Island in the Los Angeles harbor to be transformed into the largest floating restaurant in America. Her engines were removed and a permanent cement ballast was installed for stability. She opened for business in September of 1966 and was immediately a big hit with the public. From the outside, the ship appeared to be a block-long, 7-story building. Inside, it had ballrooms, lounges, and elegant dining rooms with glass enclosures, fine wood panels, and even a portrait of the royal family. The restaurant won several awards for its atmosphere, cuisine, and service. By the end of its second year of operation in 1968, it had become the most successful tourist attraction of its type in the nation, drawing nearly 2,000 visitors each day to tour, dine, and be entertained at the Port of Los Angeles. It was doing so well that its owner, Jerry Sutton, decided to open a sister restaurant in nearby Redondo Beach. But that's when the tide started to turn. In October of 1971, just after Sutton had announced his expansion plans, 3 men posing as journalists paid him a visit. They arranged for Sutton and his general manager, Mike Morrell, to drive them to the proposed building site in Redondo Beach for a tour. During this drive, the phony journalists pulled out their guns, drove to the bank, and forced Sutton to go inside and withdraw $10,000 while they held a gun to his general manager's temple. Several years later, the men were arrested and convicted of kidnapping and robbery. Roger Peterson was sentenced to life in prison. His 2 accomplices, Gary Trapnell and Jorge Padilla, who had been caught earlier than Roger, both pled guilty and were given a sentence of 5 years to life. By the time they were sentenced, Padilla was already serving a 16-year prison term in Texas for robbery, and Trapnell was already serving a life term in Kansas for hijacking an airliner. In 1972, Princess Louise II opened her doors in Redondo Beach, but she never achieved nearly the same level of popularity, and the business went belly up 3 years later in 1975. The original Princess Louise continued as a successful operation. In 1979, she was towed to a new location about a mile north in San Pedro. This was designed to place her right next to where all the action was, for this was where customers would board their cruise ships to Mexico and ferries to Catalina Island. But by 1984, the novelty of Princess Louise was wearing off. The restaurant was losing money and was sold. The new buyer, Marianne Perkoff, had grand plans to turn business around, but a series of unfortunate events occurred shortly thereafter which did little to help the restaurant's image. In November of 1985, the restaurant's customers had front row seats as they helplessly watched 2 helicopters that provided air taxi service to nearby Catalina Island collide in midair. Diners understandably lost their appetites as they witnessed one of the helicopter's occupants, who was on his honeymoon, being torn out of the aircraft and then killed and dismembered by the spinning rotor blade. The other helicopter plummeted into the harbor, just barely missing the Princess Louise, and crashed upside down in the water. People attending a wedding reception on the Princess Louise watched rescuers pull the injured out of the water, and they recounted hearing screams about a lost baby. Luckily, its occupants, including the infant, lived after being hospitalized for their injuries, which included treatment for swallowing gasoline mixed with seawater. And a little over 2 years later, in January of 1988, stunned restaurant customers watched as the bloated, decomposed body of a man who, a month earlier, had jumped off of the nearby Vincent Thomas Bridge to his death was towed past the restaurant windows. The restaurant owners filed for bankruptcy in 1988, and the SS Princess Louise restaurant forever closed her doors on January 15, 1989. Due to the owner's bankruptcy, she was seized by the Bank of San Pedro, and repairs were ordered so she could be resold. She was sandblasted, repainted, and inspected for sale. The newly refreshed Princess Louise spent the next 10 days floating patiently in her berth while the bank hunted for a buyer, but there were no bites. Then, somewhat mysteriously, on October 30th, 1989, a security guard heard a loud crash on the ship and went below to investigate. It was then that the guard noticed the ship beginning to tilt under her feet. The guard raced upstairs and jumped to shore. Moments later, the ship capsized, splashing onto its starboard side in 23 feet of water. Its smokestack snapped off from the top deck. The cause of the capsize remains a mystery. One inspector concluded that bolts may have popped off some of the newly installed steel plates on the ship's ballast tanks, which give it stability. Once the plates loosened, then water from the tanks would burst free, flooding the vessel and capsizing it. But the insurers of the ship, Lloyd's of London, were, to put it mildly, suspicious of the whole matter and refused to issue payment on the policy to the beneficiaries. The threat of ongoing lawsuits doomed any chance the ship had for restoration. Eventually, the Bank of San Pedro sold the Princess Louise to a Canadian salvage company for the incredible sum of $1. The salvage company's plan was to sink the ship off nearby Point Vicente to be used as an underwater scuba destination. But when the company discovered that $50,000 worth of artifacts had already been plundered from the ship by scuba divers as it rested on its starboard side in the harbor, the offer was withdrawn. So the next plan was to sink the vessel in 500 feet of water near Catalina Island to create an artificial reef. 8 months after Princess Louise had capsized, tugboats towed her out of the harbor home she had held for 25 years, with large crowds gathering to say their goodbyes. Water was observed cascading from dozens of holes in her barnacle-covered hull. After just 2 hours into her 12-hour final voyage, Princess Louise gave up the fight and slowly sank to rest at the bottom of 900 feet of water. Witnesses claimed that she went down gracefully, like a lady. And that's where she remains to this day, too deep to be disturbed by divers, so she can rest peacefully. And that brings us to the third piece of graffiti. It provides absolutely no foreshadowing to what has been called the greatest high seas rescue in the history of the United States Coast Guard. And it happened just 3 short years after Captain Wobeka and the Princeton Dam first sailed into Skagway's harbor in 1977. The Princeton Dam, built in 1973, was Holland America's newest ship. While it was also the smallest, it still had 6 decks and a capacity of 390 passengers. On October 4, 1980, the Princeton Dam was on the 3rd day of a 29-day cruise from Vancouver, British Columbia, up the Inside Passage and across the Pacific to Asia. The ship had just left Ketchikan, Alaska, and was on its way up to Glacier Bay. This would be the passengers' first night on the open seas, and many reported feeling seasick. That night, a fire was sparked in the engine room of the diesel-powered ship. By 1 a.m., the ship stopped moving and alarms broke out. The captain made an announcement informing the passengers about the fire and assuring them that everything was under control. But by 3:30, the fire had only gotten worse, spreading several decks above the engine room to the dining room, engulfing the cabins in between them in flames as well. The fire could not be fought because water pressure had been lost, but the passengers evacuated to the upper decks, some only in their pajamas, and stayed calm. The entertainment crew interacted with the passengers and sang show tunes with them. One of the musicians leading the passengers in song was a young man who would later reach worldwide fame as the New Age singer and musician known as Yanni. Just after 5 a.m., Captain Wabeka gave the order to abandon ship. This wasn't an easy call because a typhoon was approaching and the ship was 150 miles out from land. There were more than 500 people on the ship and there were just 7 lifeboats and 3 rafts. The lifeboats had a capacity of 60 people. With water temperatures hovering around the 50-degree Fahrenheit range, survival rates in the water would be only around 15 minutes. Some people had reported to the upper deck in bare feet in their pajamas, so they used the lounge curtains to protect them from the cold. 90 people were crammed into some of the lifeboats that were designed to hold only 60. As the boats were lowered into the water, lines got tangled and the lifeboats slammed into the side of the ship. The motors and emergency radios didn't work in some of the lifeboats, and a few were even reported to have broken rudders. But there was a stroke of luck. October 4th, 1980 was also Juneau's 100th birthday, and the Coast Guard cutter Boutwell happened to be in town to join the celebration. Around 1 a.m. in the morning, word got out that a cruise ship was on fire, and the crew assembled to start the rescue operation. But it would take time to get there, and the approaching storm was doing them no favors. Other ships, like an oil tanker that was scheduled to sail to Texas, rerouted to get to the Princeton Dam as quickly as possible. 2 hours after the captain's order to abandon ship, the first large ship arrived, beginning a 10-hour-long rescue involving helicopters that would hover over a lifeboat, drop a sling or a basket in, and hoist individuals up into the helicopter until it reached its weight limit. Because of the storm, the winds were strong and the waves were very high. After hoisting about 9 passengers from a lifeboat, some helicopters reached their weight limits and had to fly to the oil tanker to drop the passengers off. In the first hour of the rescue, 150 people were airlifted to the tanker. Thanks to the storm, the seas had reached 30-foot swells with winds of 60 knots. Soon, the storm was so bad that the helicopters couldn't fly anymore. So those still in the lifeboats had to hope that a boat on the sea would spot them and rescue them. Most of the Princeton Dam's passengers were elderly, so they couldn't climb the 40-foot Jacob's ladder to the ship. So the crew sent a man down to the boat with a horse collar and manually hauled each survivor up, one by one, using a hand winch. Just as they were winding down rescue operations, they realized that there was still one more lifeboat out there. That last lifeboat was not discovered until around 2 a.m., which was 25 hours after the fire had originally broken out on the Princeton Dam. If a helicopter had to return to land to refuel, the passengers on board accompanied it instead of being dropped off on the rescuing ships. So some passengers were separated from their loved ones. The more than 500 passengers and crew were brought ashore to Yakutat, Kodiak, Sitka, and Valdez with little more than the clothes on their backs. Captain Wabeka and his firefighters finally left the Princeton Dam as flames engulfed the upper decks. He was the last to leave the ship. When he reached safety, he looked skyward and saluted with hands clasped high above his head. No passenger or crew member had been lost. Inspectors tried to return to the Princeton Dam to assess the cause of the fire, but weather prevented them from boarding the listing ship, which was still on fire. So instead, the plan was to slowly tow the cruise vessel to Portland, Oregon. But just 2 days later, the fire reflashed and spread throughout the ship, blowing out its portholes. And each day, the ship took on more water. Just after daybreak on October 11th, 1 week after the rescue mission began, the Princeton Dam rolled over on its side, resting there for a little over a minute before sliding, bow first, to rest 1 mile below the surface. When you're in Juneau, consider stopping by the Herface Saunders Federal Building to see the bronze plaque that commemorates the bravery of the U.S. Coast Guard and other rescuers, which resulted in a miracle on the sea. Thanks to their bravery, no lives were lost and injuries were minimal. But those passengers surely had a story to tell at parties that couldn't be beat. Thanks for joining me. I hope you liked this little dive into some lesser-known but fascinating history. I'm sure that Skagway's unofficial registry of ships has even more tales to tell. Do you know some of them? Please leave a comment and share what you've heard. The next time you're back in Skagway, take a close look at the graffiti wall and see if there's even more history to discover. Looking for more tips to help you enjoy every moment of your vacation? Then consider subscribing to Destination for Vacations channel. This was the inaugural video for the channel, and hopefully it's not all downhill from here. Kidding aside, my goal is to make the kind of videos that I enjoy watching. Interesting tidbits, but not a lecture. It's about the destination, not me. Something that will hopefully add a little value and enjoyment to your vacation. Thanks again for watching. Perhaps you can join me again in one of these videos. Until then, here's hoping that your next adventure is just around the corner.